All right. Hello, fellow Sapiens. Sit back, relax, and prepare to step into the Neanderthal paradox, why the others vanished. A quiet journey into the last days of another humanity. The ones who are still here until suddenly they weren't. This is Sleepless Homo. Soft science, slow storytelling, and deep time told gently. No hype, no drama, just a calm walk through the archaeology of being, guided by researchers who know how fragile every footprint in the past truly is. Now imagine this. The world is quiet, colder than the one you know, and filled with long shadows cast by fires that barely hold back the dark. Somewhere between 45,000 and 40,000 years ago, a small group of Neanderthals sits beside one of those fires, unaware that they are living inside the closing chapter of their kind. Extinction never feels like a moment. It feels like an ordinary night. A few sparks rise, a few voices murmur, and the world turns without telling anyone what it is about to take away. Archaeology lets us see the edges of this moment, but never the centre. What remains are traces, soot pressed into cave ceilings, a scatter of flakes from stone tools shaped by hands we will never meet, the faint outline of a hearth built from stones warmed again and again during countless winters. These are not grand ruins or monuments. They are the last fingerprints of a humanity that had survived ice ages, predators, scarcity, and silence for hundreds of thousands of years. They had endured everything the world had asked of them, and yet the final centuries of their presence look strangely fragile, more fragmented than anything that came before. That fragility is not a judgment. It is simply what the layers of earth whisper back to us. When we look at the late Refugia of Iberia, for example, we do not find signs of collapse, but signs of reduction. Caves that once echoed with activity become quieter. Hearths become smaller. The number of occupied sites begins to thin. In places like coastal Cantabria and inland shelters across Andalusia, we can still find blackened ceilings where fires burned steadily enough to stain stone. To kneel beneath these ceilings today is to feel a strange nearness. Someone warmed themselves here during the last long winters of their people's story. Someone fed a child or tended an elder, or pressed a sharp flake into a piece of hide to make it last a little longer in the cold. These traces are not dramatic, but they are intimate. They remind us that extinction is rarely loud. Across the Caucasus, in mountain valleys where stone walls trap cold air even in warmer seasons, the pattern looks similar. Neanderthal groups that had once moved across wide landscapes narrowed their range. The sites we find there are often small, a few centimetres of ash, fragments of bone from hunted fauna like red deer or wild goat, occasional clusters of stone flakes left where a toolmaker sat for one afternoon before moving on. What we see in these layers is persistence, not decline. A people doing what they had always done, using techniques they trusted, surviving as their ancestors had survived for tens of thousands of years. Archaeology does not show despair, it shows routine. In some shelters across the Russian plains and southern Siberia, we find even smaller windows of life, almost like faint echoes caught between layers of silt. The tools look familiar, carefully prepared flakes struck from prepared cores, a method that required skill, planning, and a lifetime of practice. These are not the artifacts of a failing species. They are the artifacts of an experienced one. If anything, what stands out in these final millennia is how consistent their knowledge remained. Their way of shaping stone was the same in Iberia, the Caucasus, and the far east of their range. Knowledge travelled through generations like a steady flame passed hand to hand. There is a quiet dignity in that. To hold on to what works is not a weakness. It is a survival strategy. Yet archaeology also shows how thin the margins had become. When the land grew harsher in certain regions, Neanderthal groups did not expand or reorganize, they contracted. They moved into protected valleys, caves with reliable shelter, slopes where herds still passed often enough to support small bands. These refugia were not prisons. They were familiar havens, places where people could still live by memory and skill. If you could stand in one of those caves 40,000 years ago, you would see nothing that suggested an ending. You would see firelight glancing off stone walls. You would see hands shaping tools by touch. You would see a routine that had kept them alive longer than our own species had even existed. Archaeologists often talk about the archaeology of presence, meaning the hearths, tools and bones that show where lives were lived. But in the final centuries of Neanderthal history, we also encounter the archaeology of absence gaps in the record grow wider. Some valleys that once held signs of seasonal movement become quiet. Certain shelters contain only thin sequences of occupation, as though groups returned less often or stayed for shorter periods of time. Again, this is not evidence of collapse in the dramatic sense. It is the slow contraction of a population that was already small, already scattered, living at densities that would make any recovery precarious. Imagine walking into a cave just after one of their groups moved on. You would see the circle of stones where a fire had burned low during the night. You would see cracked bones open for marrow. You might find a single stone flake lying on the ground, the result of one chip struck too far from the core. These tiny things speak because there is so little else left from these moments. The deeper we go into the timeline, the fewer artifacts appear. It is not an abrupt stop. It is a thinning whisper. One of the humbler truths in archaeology is that the end of a population often leaves fewer traces than its flourishing. We tend to imagine extinction as a catastrophe, but in the case of the last Neanderthals, the ground shows something quieter. Small groups, widely separated, living along coastlines and mountain passes, maintaining old ways that had always worked. The challenge, from what we can see, was not that their knowledge failed, but that the world around them shifted in ways that reduced the space where that knowledge remained effective. That is a deeply human problem. All species face it eventually. In Iberia, the stone scatters from these final communities are often made from local raw materials rather than exotic ones brought from distant quarries. This suggests shorter travelling distances and reduced territories. People were staying close to home. In the Caucasus, we find similar patterns of localization. When archaeologists map the origin of raw stone, the trails become shorter over time. It is a small signal, but meaningful. Smaller ranges hint at smaller populations. Smaller populations mean fewer opportunities to share knowledge, fewer apprentices learning from elders, fewer mates, fewer hands keeping fires alive. This is not drama. It is arithmetic. Soot layers and cave ceilings also help us trace these patterns. In some Iberian caves, the soot grows thin near the top of the sequence, showing less frequent burning. In others, the soot is strong in some periods and almost absent in the next, suggesting irregular visits rather than steady occupation. The rhythms of life became sporadic. Some caves that were used for thousands of years appear to host their last small gatherings during this window, between 45,000 and 40,000 years ago. After that, the ceilings remain pale. Even abandoned shelters reveal something about how they lived near the end. In places where winters bit hard, Neanderthals built simple windbreaks of stone and wood, often just enough to redirect cold drafts. These structures leave faint outlines we can barely detect today. When they vanish from a site's uppermost layers, it often means the people simply stopped coming, not that anything dramatic occurred. Archaeology is full of endings that look like that. A hearth gone cold, a shelter left behind, a place once familiar becoming silent after generations. What strikes many researchers is how normal these final traces appear. Nothing in them suggests panic. Nothing suggests a sudden break. They look like the continuation of a life that had always been lived in small bands, close to the land, with tools that demanded skill but not reinvention. If you were one of them, you would not know your population was contracting. You would simply wake up one morning and notice there were fewer voices around the fire. You would travel to a valley where your ancestors hunted and find that the herd paths had shifted, or that the animals were harder to track that year. You would do what your people had always done. Follow memory, follow instinct, follow the habits that had kept your lineage alive through countless winters. All of this is why the question of extinction feels so difficult. None of these sites tell us that Neanderthals foresaw anything. They show persistence. They show adaptation in familiar forms. They show a species living inside its long-earned expertise. This is not the archaeology of failure. It is the archaeology of limits. When we step back from these data points, we see the outline of a world that was changing in ways that made survival spaces narrower. From Iberia to the Caucasus to the Far Eastern Plains, the final Neanderthal presence looks like a constellation with its stars slowly going out, one by one, for each star burned in the same way as before. That is what makes this moment in deep time so haunting. They disappeared as they lived, quietly. There is a humility required in saying this. We do not know every cause, every pressure, every choice that shaped these last centuries. The archaeological record is too partial, too uneven, too dependent on the accidents of preservation. What we can say is that these final traces show no sign of losing their identity. They did not abandon their knowledge. They did not falter in their way of being. The world simply left them less room, and small populations navigating harsh landscapes have always stood close to the edge of silence. And so the last Neanderthals leave us not a dramatic ending but a soft one. The glow of a final hearth, the last blade struck from a stone core, the faintest smear of soot on a ceiling now touched only by light. If extinction had a feeling, perhaps it would be this, the sense of a routine continuing until the world quietly stops answering back. If you enjoy falling asleep to deep time, studying with quiet facts, or listening while driving through the night, you're in the right place. Tell me in the comments where you are right now, curled in bed, cooking, working, wandering. And if you want more slow, thoughtful science, feel free to like the video or subscribe. It helps other sleepless minds find a little calm in the noise. If you drift off, timestamps will wait for you when you return. Alright, let's continue. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. A body built not for comfort but for endurance. A chest shaped like a shelter against the cold. Arms thick enough to split marrow-rich bones. Legs compact and powerful, not for speed, but for stability in deep winter woods. Now imagine that this body, perfected over hundreds of thousands of years, wakes up one morning in a world that has quietly begun to shift beneath its feet. Adaptation is a gift, but it is also an anchor, and the Neanderthal body was one of the most specialized anchors evolution ever crafted. Their story begins long before the last of them walked across Eurasia. It begins around 300,000 years ago, when their lineage sharpened its identity in the forests and valleys of a colder world. Over immense stretches of time, generation after generation, Neanderthal anatomy drifted toward one principle: survival through robustness. Their bodies were not simply large, they were dense, engineered in ways that reveal intimate details about their lives. When anatomists study their rib cages, for example, they find a shape unlike our own. Their chests flare outward, creating a deep, barrel-like cavity. This is not a stylistic difference. It is a physiological one. A large thoracic cavity means large lungs. Large lungs mean more oxygen taken in with each breath, more fuel for a body that ran hot, hunted hard, and needed energy fast in cold seasons when food was scarcer and movement more demanding. Imagine the stamina required to stalk game through snowy forests, or climb steep slopes while carrying the weight of tools, hides, and sometimes injured companions. That wide chest was not decorative. It was functional biology, earned through landscape and necessity. Their spines, too, were subtly shaped for this life. Broad vertebrae, thick muscle attachments, deep stabilizing structures. A Neanderthal torso was more like a living framework for strength than a frame for flexibility. And strength mattered. Everything in their world exacted a physical cost. From this core outward, their limbs were equally specialized. Their arms carried thick humeri and powerful forearms. Their grip strength, reconstructed from the wear patterns on bones, suggest lives spent repeatedly hauling, scraping, pulling, and breaking. It was a world of tasks that did not forgive frailty. Their legs, shorter and more compact than ours, carried dense muscle. These proportions are not random. Shorter limbs preserve heat. They also distribute weight efficiently in uneven ground. For hundreds of thousands of years, these bodies moved through forests where cold air pooled in valleys and where wind bit through exposed clearings. A tall, light frame would lose heat in such conditions. A compact one conserves it. To touch a Neanderthal femur in a museum today, even through glass, is to confront a kind of human strength we no longer possess. The cortical bone thickness is immense. It speaks of heavy workloads begun early in life and continued without rest. Not heroic strength, not theatrical strength, but the quiet, everyday weight of existence. When researchers model how many calories such a body required, they find high estimates, thousands upon thousands of calories per day, depending on season and activity. This was not indulgence or overexertion. It was fuel for survival. A metabolism tuned to cold environments becomes a furnace, always needing more. This level of robustness shaped their childhoods as well. Evidence from juvenile fossils suggests that Neanderthals reached certain developmental milestones faster than we do. Their skeletons show earlier dental eruption, stronger limb development at younger ages, and patterns of growth that emphasize physical readiness. Childhood, for them, was likely shorter in duration but more intense in demands. From early on, young Neanderthals were being folded into the physical rhythms of their groups, learning to move through dense forests, learning the feel of stone in the hand, learning the balance between endurance and caution. If your world is carved from cold, you learn fast or you do not survive. Even their teeth tell a story of strong demands. Microscopic scratches and heavy wear appear on many Neanderthal teeth, not only from eating tough or sinewy foods, but from using their mouths as third hands. The edges of hides, the fibres of plants, the grip on a strip of material being shaped into cord or binding, all left their marks. In the archaeological record, we see the signature of habitual clenching, pulling, tearing, not because they lacked tools, but because the mouth is one of the strongest and most versatile grips the human body has over tens of thousands of years. This behaviour leaves a distinctive record in enamel. If their bodies were shaped by hardship, they were also shaped by resilience. Many Neanderthal bones show healed fractures, ribs that knitted back together after violent impacts, limbs that mended despite misalignment, skulls that show signs of trauma but also survival. What is striking is how many injuries were survived long enough to leave healing patterns that requires not only physical strength, but social care. A badly injured individual would need help to hunt, move, or even stay warm. The bones suggest that such help was given. When you spend your life in small bands, each skilled hand matters, and each life, no matter how wounded, is not easily abandoned. In this way, Neanderthal anatomy reflects not only evolutionary pressures but communal ones. Their bodies absorbed enormous punishment, and their communities evidently supported those who could not keep pace for a time. Though we cannot hear their voices, we can see the decisions their ancestors made written in bone. The landscape around them also influenced how they moved. Dense forests and rugged terrain reward balance and stability. The strong joints and joint surfaces of Neanderthal skeletons indicate frequent climbing, crouching, navigating slopes and sudden directional shifts. They were built to inhabit complex spaces, not open plains. Even their hands show this interplay of strength and precision. Broad fingertips, strong grips, and muscle attachments reminiscent of skilled tool workers. Their tools may not have changed quickly across time, but the hands that shaped them were practiced, efficient, and powerful. And yet, within this strength lies a subtle vulnerability. A body perfectly adapted to one set of conditions becomes less flexible when those conditions shift. The robustness that once conserved heat, that once allowed immense physical workloads, that once matched the demands of cold forests, also tied Neanderthals to these demands. It anchored them to a lifestyle in which constant movement, constant caloric intake, and constant muscular engagement were necessary. They were not fragile in the moment, they were fragile in the long view. Adaptation has a cost, and sometimes that cost is paid centuries later. But seen on its own terms, the Neanderthal physique was a masterpiece of environmental tuning. Their noses, sometimes exaggerated in popular imagery, were actually shaped for controlling airflow and perhaps warming cold air during inhalation. Their sinuses were large and complex, part of a system designed to cope with frequent cold exposure. Their skulls, with thick brow ridges and elongated shapes, housed brains comparable in size to ours. This was not a simple species. It was a sophisticated lineage honed by selective forces different from those that shaped our own. One of the most fascinating aspects of Neanderthal anatomy is how consistently it appears across their entire range. Whether in Western Europe or the Caucasus or Central Eurasia, the same traits recur. Robust limbs, wide chests, powerful hands. This consistency tells us that their bodies were not an accident of place. They were a shared inheritance, passed through long lines of ancestors who survived cold seasons, dangerous hunts, and narrow ecological margins. In that sense, every Neanderthal skeleton discovered is a record of perseverance. When we look at the physiological demands revealed by these remains, we also glimpse what their daily lives must have felt like. To maintain such bodies, they would have needed to eat frequently and well. Hunting large animals would have been essential. Gathering plant foods would have helped, but the musculature and bone density we see suggest a protein-rich diet. This, in turn, implies cooperation and planning. One individual could not feed a group. It required teamwork, knowledge of seasonal patterns, and the stamina to track prey across difficult terrain. Many of the questions we wish we could answer remain beyond our reach. We cannot say what they felt when they looked at a cold morning sky, or how they understood the aches in their bodies after years of effort. We can only listen to the bones, and the bones tell us that their lives were physically demanding from the earliest years. Where on joints appears early spinal compression is common, fractures are frequent. But the story is not one of fragility. It is a story of people meeting their world with the bodies they had and succeeding for a staggeringly long time. There is a strange humility in realizing how much we still do not know. Why exactly their growth patterns differed from ours is still debated. How their metabolism functioned day to day remains partly speculative. Even the exact limits of their endurance are subjects of ongoing study. But the broad picture is clear. Neanderthals were built for cold forests, for close-range hunting, for daily physicality, for a world where survival was measured in calories burned and calories consumed. Their bodies were answers to ancient questions the land asked. And for hundreds of thousands of years, those answers were correct. But when a body becomes perfectly adapted to one set of conditions, the room for alternative paths narrows. Specialization is strength until it is not. And the world, as it always does, kept changing, slowly at first and then in ways that made old strengths hard to maintain. The Neanderthal body was not flawed. If anything, it was too finely tuned. What once served them so well eventually became a weight they could not shift, carried quietly into the final chapters of their long story. Imagine this. You wake to the sound of branches cracking in the distance, not from an animal but from cold strong enough to break wood. You step outside your shelter expecting the familiar hush of a forest, but the trees are thinner, the air feels sharper, the land looks the same, but something subtle has shifted. A species can live through many winters like this before realizing that the world beneath its feet is no longer the world it adapted to. Between 60,000 and 40,000 years ago, Eurasia became a place where the ground changed faster than memory could keep up. The archaeological record alone cannot tell us this story, but paleoclimate science can. When we look at the tiny air bubbles trapped in Greenland's deep ice cores, each one a miniature globe sealed for tens of thousands of years, we find abrupt temperature swings so fast they almost feel impossible. Within a single human lifetime, the climate could snap from relatively mild conditions to bitter cold. These shifts were not gentle transitions, they were sharp thresholds. One set of layers shows thick clusters of dust, blown across a drying landscape during a cold pulse. The next shows clearer, wetter conditions. To stand in front of these ice cores today is to feel how quickly the world can change without warning. Neanderthals lived through every one of these swings. Across Eurasia, pollen trapped in ancient sediments tells the same story at ground level. Grains from birch, pine and oak begin to thin in some regions, replaced by pollen from grasses and small shrubs that thrive in colder, more open environments. In lakes that have quietly collected sediments for thousands of years, the pollen sequence becomes a slow-motion record of forest retreat. In warmer phases, the woods expanded, but during certain intervals, especially those associated with rapid cooling events, the forests pulled back. Whole valleys became exposed grasslands where only decades earlier, thick canopies had filtered sunlight. For a species shaped by wooded landscapes, this was not just a change in scenery, it was a change in everything. Shelter, prey availability, cover during hunts, and even the kinds of materials available for fuel. The transformation was not uniform. It happened in patches, like a quilt unravelling at different seams. Some regions remained forested refuges for long stretches, while others shifted abruptly to open steppe mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, saiga antelope, and horses expanded into these new spaces. Forest-dwelling species retreated or collapsed. The bones of animals found at archaeological sites begin to change accordingly. Species once common in Neanderthal hunting grounds, like forest-dwelling deer, appear at lower quantities. Meanwhile, bones from steppe specialists grow more frequent in certain layers. This faunal turnover signals that the world Neanderthals had known for hundreds of millennia was becoming less predictable, less uniform, and in many places less familiar. What makes this period especially striking is the appearance of Heinrich events, episodes where massive armadas of icebergs carved from northern ice sheets and drifted into the North Atlantic. As they melted, they poured fresh water into the ocean, disrupting circulation patterns and triggering sudden cooling. These events left their signature in layers of marine sediment as thin bands of crushed rock carried far from their original coasts. When these layers line up with terrestrial climate proxies, we see moments of abrupt continent-wide cold. Temperatures did not simply drop, they plunged. Winds intensified, precipitation patterns shifted, forests that had persisted for centuries suddenly contracted, leaving behind barren stretches where roots could no longer take hold. Imagine living through one of these drops. A winter arrives that feels harsher than any your elders described. Animals that once moved through the forest no longer appear. The streams freeze deeper, the wood becomes brittle. A species can survive one such winter through memory. But when winters like this repeat, or when a brief warming phase tricks the land into regrowth only for the cold to return again, memory becomes unreliable. The old hunting paths no longer lead to herds. The places where berries once grew return only dry stems. The patterns that once guided survival begin to fail. What is especially humbling is that Neanderthals faced not a single catastrophic event, but an accumulation of stresses. The centuries between 60,000 and 40,000 years ago were marked by a repeating rhythm, warming intervals that seemed to promise stability, followed by sudden plunges into cold that stripped those promises away. In stable environments, traditions can carry a species far. In unstable ones, those same traditions become difficult to maintain, yet the archaeological layers show no sign that Neanderthals abandoned their ways. They adapted in familiar patterns, moving into sheltered areas, exploiting microhabitats where conditions were slightly better, and shifting seasonally as they always had. But what happens when the forests that once buffered winter winds begin to fragment? When the canopy that once provided cover during hunts opens into vulnerable spaces? What happens when a body shaped for endurance in woodlands must now move across exposed plains where the cold strikes harder, where prey behave differently, and where danger comes not from ambush but from distance? This is the quiet challenge revealed by climate data. Neanderthals faced a world that was slowly turning their strengths into questions. Pollen diagrams from Central Europe show an especially vivid picture of this transformation. Layers rich in oak and hazel give way to grass and sedge during colder intervals. The shift happens in thin slices of sediment, sometimes representing only decades. When we combine this with charcoal records, we see fewer signs of forest fires in certain periods, suggesting reduced forest cover. The land was not dead, but it was different. Open environments demand different strategies for movement, for tracking animals, and for finding shelter. A species adapted to one form of landscape can learn to navigate another, but the pace of change matters. When change arrives too quickly, knowledge and memory cannot recalibrate fast enough. Even at the microscopic scale, we see evidence of ecological strain. Studies of ancient soils show changes in carbon composition, indicating shifts in plant communities. These shifts ripple upward through the food chain. Herbivores change their ranges, carnivores adjust their hunting grounds, and apex predators must travel farther between reliable patches of prey. In a vast landscape this might seem manageable, but for populations already thinly distributed, it adds an invisible pressure. And yet the evidence also shows endurance. Neanderthals did not disappear at the first sign of ecological stress. They persisted because resilience was built into their lineage. Their bodies held heat, their hands knew how to work stone, and their social groups likely shared the burden of survival. But endurance is not the same as expansion. As forests retracted, the habitable zones they depended on grew smaller and more scattered. the places where everything still worked began to shrink. These shrinking pockets are what archaeologists call refugia, but for the people living there, they would have simply felt like familiar valleys, sheltered ridges, and reliable hunting paths that still held meaning when the broader world seemed to shift. The Greenland ice cores show especially sharp oscillations during this window. Some transitions happen within a few decades, the kind of timescale that one generation could feel, but perhaps struggle to explain. To children born during a mild interval, winter might have seemed tolerable. To their children born during a cold phase, winter would have felt like a punishment. Entire childhoods could unfold under different climatic regimes, and elders who once provided stable knowledge might have found that their memories of the land no longer matched the land itself. One of the most subtle forms of stress is unpredictability. Cold climates alone are survivable, sudden shifts are survivable, but unpredictability itself undermines confidence in old strategies. When a species evolves traditions rooted in stable environmental cues, and those cues begin to flicker in and out of reliability, the burden falls not only on bodies, but on memory, planning, and the very rhythms of life. Faunal remains from this period underscore the shift. In several European sites, researchers observe a decline in forest-dwelling species and a rise in animals that prefer open steppe. This does not mean Neanderthals could not hunt these animals. It means the rules were changing. Tracking a red deer in a forest is different from tracking a horse on open steppe. Ambush becomes harder. Cover becomes scarce. The margin for error widens. Every change in prey requires changes in movement and energy expenditure. A species with high caloric needs must balance every decision carefully. What emerges from all this evidence is not a narrative of failure, but a narrative of tightening constraints. Neanderthals were capable of living through harsh conditions. They had done so for far longer than our species has existed. The challenge was not the cold itself. It was the instability of cold and warmth, the oscillation of forests and grasslands, the fragmentation of once continuous habitats, their world frayed in slow motion, one thread at a time. As we study these patterns today, we must admit the limits of our understanding. The land does not give us every detail. It gives us signals: pollen, ice, bone, soil, sediment. We assemble these signals into stories, knowing they will always be incomplete. But the broad outline is consistent. Between 60,000 and 40,000 years ago, the world Neanderthals inhabited became less predictable, less stable, and less aligned with the adaptations that had once served them so well. And perhaps the quiet question left behind is this: how long can any species endure when the ground it understands begins to shift faster than the knowledge carried through generations? What if I told you that a single stone shaped in a familiar way could carry a lineage through hundreds of millennia? Imagine holding a tool that your great-grandparents would recognize, and their great-grandparents and ancestors so distant they no longer have names. Between 100,000 and 50,000 years ago, the Neanderthal world was held together by objects like these. Their tools did not change quickly, not because of a lack of intelligence or imagination, but because the things they made worked. In a landscape of cold forests, close-range hunting, and heavy daily labour, reliability was worth more than novelty. To understand why their technology remained so stable, you have to picture the environment these tools were made for: dense woodlands, steep river valleys, and shadowed limestone shelters shaped every decision. Stone was everywhere, but useful stone was not. A good flint nodule could become the heart of a day's work, transformed through a technique that archaeologists call l'évaloir. This method was not simple. It required preparing a core through a sequence of careful strikes, each one shaping the surface to produce a final flake, with a predictable form. In modern terms, it was a form of planning, a technique that married foresight with muscle memory. When you hold a Levallois flake today, you hold an object born from practiced hands. Many of these flakes were used for cutting hide, slicing meat, or scraping wood. Others were retouched into points or scrapers. But the real power of Levallois technology was consistency. A Neanderthal toolmaker could begin the process knowing almost exactly what the final shape would be. This predictability mattered in a world where time and energy were precious. If daylight was fading and the cold pressed in, you needed to know that your next flake would be sharp enough to finish the job. Innovation is appealing to us because we live in a world of surplus. In a world of tight margins, predictability is survival. When we compare Mysterian toolkits across regions from Western Europe to the Caucasus, the same patterns appear. Variations exist, of course. Different groups shape their tools to different uses. Some sites show a preference for elongated scrapers, others for robust points, others for thick-backed knives. But beneath the surface, the fundamental logic remains constant. Carefully prepared cores producing reliable flakes. This is not stagnation. It is cultural continuity. Imagine sitting beside a Neanderthal toolmaker 100,000 years ago. You would hear the same rhythm repeated again and again. Strike, examine, strike, prepare, strike. Each motion would have been learned in childhood, practiced in adolescence, refined through adulthood. Hands repeated what other hands had taught them. There is something almost ceremonial about it, not in a symbolic sense, but in the quiet weight of tradition passed across generations. These tools carried the memory of a people in their edges, but stone was only part of their technological world. The wooden spears found at sites like Schöningen, although far older than the window we focus on here, tell us that thrusting spears remained central to Neanderthal hunting. These weapons were not simple sticks. They were carefully shaped projectiles made from the toughest part of a tree, often spruce or pine, carved so the heaviest end balanced the thrust. Experimental reconstructions show how much skill was needed to craft them. A poor spear could shatter on impact or fail to penetrate the thick hide of forest animals. A good one could bring down a deer or a wild horse at close range. Close-range hunting was dangerous, and the skeletal injuries Neanderthals carried into adulthood show how often they placed themselves within striking distance of powerful prey. A thrusting spear is not a weapon of distance. It is a weapon of courage and cooperation. To use it well, you need to understand how an animal moves, how to read its final steps before it turns, and how to strike with force at exactly the right moment. For a species living in cold forests, where trees limited visibility and long-distance projectiles were less effective, thrusting spears were more than adequate. They matched the landscape, the prey, and the body. The challenge of hide processing also shaped their toolkit. In the cold seasons, hides were essential for warmth, bedding, shelter lining, and carrying containers. Thick animal skins require long hours of scraping to remove fat and tissue. Scrapers made from stone flakes are perfect for this task, and Neanderthal scrapers show heavy use wear from repeated contact with hide. Their edges were rejuvenated over and over again, the same flake being resharpened until it could no longer hold form. This kind of labour demands simple, durable tools that can be repaired quickly. In this sense, the Mysterian toolkit was an ideal system, modular, maintainable, and consistent. One of the most remarkable pieces of Neanderthal technology, however, is invisible to the casual eye: birch tar. To make it, you must heat birch bark in low oxygen conditions, an early form of controlled chemical transformation. If the temperature goes too high, the tar burns. If it is too low, the bark merely chars. Achieving the right conditions requires constructing a sealed or partially sealed container and tending the fire with careful attention. What emerges, if the process is successful, is a black sticky substance unlike anything else in nature, a natural adhesive capable of binding stone tools to wooden handles. The discovery of birch tar at Neanderthal sites reveals a profound level of technical knowledge. This was not something stumbled upon accidentally, it required experimentation and repeated success. The tar allowed them to haft tools more securely, improving leverage and reducing hand strain. A hafted scraper could work hides for the longer periods before tiring the wrist. A hafted point could deliver a more stable thrust. In archaeological layers spanning tens of thousands of years, birch tar appears consistently. Like the stone tools it joined with, it was part of a technological tradition that endured because it was effective. Some researchers have wondered why Neanderthals did not adopt more rapid innovation over time, but this question reflects our own technological expectations, shaped by a world that reinvents itself every decade. In the deep past, innovation was not measured by speed but by reliability. A technique that keeps working is a technique worth preserving. Consider how long humans used hand axes before the Mousterian era. Hundreds of thousands of years procedural knowledge in the Paleolithic world does not follow our timelines. Moreover, Neanderthals lived in small, widely dispersed groups. Innovation spreads through contact, and frequent contact between distant groups accelerates experimentation. But small populations scattered across vast landscapes experience slow cultural diffusion. New ways of shaping stone or processing hides might emerge occasionally, but they would remain local unless circumstances forced change. The archaeological record suggests that for long periods the circumstances did not. Their toolkit, steady and reliable, met the needs of their world. There is also the question of energy. Every change in technique demands a cost. Teaching new methods requires time. Practicing them demands material. Refining them requires trial and error. In a world where everyday survival depends on caloric intake and physical labour, the margin for sustained experimentation is small. It may be that Neanderthals innovated more than we realise, but that many of those attempts were simply not preserved in stone. Organic materials rarely survive, and some inventions leave no mark detectable thousands of years later. Think of fire maintenance, shelter construction, clothing design, and hunting strategy. These are all forms of technology too, but they leave little behind for us to find. A change in how they built a windbreak or prepared a spear might vanish completely from the archaeological record. What we see in stone is only the durable fraction of their knowledge, the rest evaporated with time. And yet the stone record itself shows occasional sparks of novelty. The use of elongated flakes, special purpose tools in certain regions, adhesives appearing earlier than once thought. But these remain exceptions, not foundations. The backbone of Neanderthal technology was continuity. This continuity served them well for most of their existence. For tens of thousands of years their tools matched their landscape so precisely that large-scale change was unnecessary. Only when the world began shifting unpredictably did the question of technological flexibility become sharper. But that is a question for another part of their story, one we must approach carefully, without assuming that different choices would have guaranteed different outcomes. In the end, the tools Neanderthals left behind tell us something deeply human, that stability can be a strength, that what works becomes a tradition, that knowledge handed down through countless hands does not need to be reinvented to remain meaningful. These tools were not failures. They were the instruments of a long, successful lineage that carved out an existence in some of the harshest environments the Pleistocene had to offer. And perhaps the quiet reminder buried within these flakes and cores is this: sometimes the technologies we trust most are the ones that stay with us the longest, even when the world around us begins to change. What if I told you that a population can begin disappearing long before anyone within it notices the absence? Imagine a winter camp where every face around the fire looks familiar, where laughter still echoes against the cave walls, where the night feels ordinary. And yet somewhere far beyond that circle of warmth, another camp sits empty. Another lineage has ended. Another valley has fallen silent. Extinction does not always announce itself with catastrophe. Sometimes it begins as nothing more than the quiet shrinking of a world. Between 100,000 and 40,000 years ago, the Neanderthal story unfolded in these small, steady contractions. When we picture Neanderthals, we often imagine them through the lens of a single skeleton or the grandeur of a famous cave, but their world was built at the scale of the clan, not tribes, not villages. Small groups, often fewer than a dozen or two, moving through forests, hunting together, sharing burdens, passing on knowledge, one gesture at a time. These clans were the engines of their survival, and they were also the structures that carried the first signs of decline. To understand how collapse begins, we have to step into the realm of genetic evidence bones do not speak, but DNA does. In several Neanderthal fossils dated within this window, geneticists have uncovered patterns that point unmistakably to small, isolated populations. Low genetic diversity appears again and again, not as a one-time anomaly, but as a signature woven through their lineage. This means that for a long time Neanderthals lived in groups that were already tiny, already fragile, already at risk of losing genetic variability with every generation. Low diversity itself is not a death sentence. Many species survive with it, but it narrows the margin for resilience. If a small clan faces disease, a severe winter, an injury to a key hunter, or the disappearance of a herd's migration path, the impact hits harder. Fewer individuals means fewer backups. Fewer backups means each loss carves deeper into the group's long-term stability. But the DNA reveals more than just small numbers. In one extraordinary case from Denisova Cave, a single toe bone belonging to a Neanderthal woman tells an even more intimate story. Her genome shows that her parents were closely related, perhaps as close as half-siblings. This is not a taboo in the modern human sense. It is a consequence of extreme demographic pressure. When a population becomes too small and too isolated, choices narrow. The clan must continue, and those within it are the only partners available. Such pairings do not necessarily doom a lineage, but repeated often enough, they increase the risk of harmful mutations concentrating over time. Again, we must be careful. Inbreeding did not cause the disappearance of Neanderthals, but it is one signal among many that they were living near the limits of what a population can sustain. Population modelling helps us see this more clearly. Researchers simulate how groups of various sizes fare for long time spans under different environmental pressures. What they find is sobering. A population spread thinly across a wide region, clustered in tiny groups under fluctuating climates, can drift downward without ever experiencing a dramatic collapse. It simply becomes smaller, generation by generation, until local extinctions accumulate. This is sometimes called metapopulation decay. One group disappears here, another there. If the surviving groups cannot reconnect or exchange mates, the entire network eventually dissolves. Neanderthals appear to have lived inside such a network for many tens of thousands of years. Their distribution across Eurasia was vast, stretching from Western Europe through the Levant and into Central Asia. But this vastness was misleading. It was not a continuous sheet of habitation. It was a constellation of tiny lights, each one flickering with its own challenges, its own seasons of hardship, its own fragile continuity. Isotopic analysis of Neanderthal bones provides even deeper insight into the pressures they faced. By examining the ratios of certain elements within their remains, scientists can infer what they ate and how often their diets varied. Many Neanderthal bones reveal high trophic level signatures, meaning they relied heavily on large herbivores. This was a consistent and successful strategy until those herbivores shifted their ranges or declined in number. When prey becomes unpredictable, a population with high caloric needs faces immediate risk. Some Neanderthal individuals show signs consistent with seasonal nutritional stress, periods where dietary breadth narrowed or where food was consumed in insufficient quantities. These intermittent hardships do not necessarily kill a population outright, but they chip away at its long-term viability. Archaeological evidence supports this pattern. In some regions, occupations become thinner over time, with fewer signs of repeated visits. Fire residues appear less frequently in certain layers. This does not always mean a decline in skill or effort. It can simply reflect smaller groups leaving fewer traces. When a clan shrinks from 20 individuals to 12, the archaeological footprint becomes fainter. When it falls from 12 to 7, the footprint can nearly vanish. And yet, in these traces of decline, we also see resilience. Neanderthals survived cold phases, shifting landscapes, predator competition, and the daily struggle of high-energy lives. The persistence of their toolkits and their hunting strategies for hundreds of thousands of years shows that their cultural practices remained strong. The problem was not a lack of knowledge. It was a lack of numbers. A shrinking population feels different from a collapsing one. Imagine a group entering a winter with 5 active hunters instead of 8. That alone reshapes how much food can be delivered. Imagine a winter where only 3 elders remain who hold certain seasonal knowledge. Imagine a wounded hunter whose absence weakens the entire group's chances. Each loss compounds. Each gap deepens the strain. These are not dramatic events that leave their mark in specific layers of sediment. They are slow, cumulative patterns that archaeology can only glimpse through absence. By the time we reach 40,000 years ago, several regions that once held Neanderthal groups show long intervals with no archaeological activity at all. This absence is easy to misinterpret as a sign of abrupt disappearance, but the better explanation is quieter. Local extinctions occurred, and the remaining groups were too isolated or too few to recolonize the empty areas. Each vanished group became a break in the chain. Each break weakened the resilience of the overall population. Some valleys likely saw their final families fade away without drama. Perhaps the last surviving individuals died during a harsh season. Perhaps a hunting accident removed the last viable adults. Perhaps a young pair left in search of better grounds and never returned. The land absorbed these disappearances without a trace, because small groups leave fragile histories. In some sites, we see tantalizing evidence of reduced tool diversity. This does not mean that Neanderthals forgot techniques. It means that fewer hands were available to maintain the full range of skills. If a single skilled toolmaker died, an entire lineage of specialized craftsmanship might end with them. In small populations, expertise becomes vulnerable. It is preserved only if someone is present to carry it forward. The emotional weight of this becomes heavier when we remember that Neanderthals were not wandering alone across empty plains. They lived in families, shared burdens, and likely cared for injured members. Every contraction in population was not a statistic. It was the quiet fading of a community, the loss of familiar voices around a fire. Population collapse, when viewed from deep time, is not always a calamity. It is sometimes simply the slow thinning of a species that has reached the edge of its ecological flexibility. Small, isolated clans can persist for thousands of years, but without connection and renewal, the network cannot rebuild. As we reconstruct this story, humility is essential. We do not know every detail. The bones that survived represent only a fraction of the individuals who lived. The DNA we have belongs to a handful of people in a lineage of many thousands. The isotopic signals reflect diets from specific regions, not the whole of Eurasia. But when all these threads are woven together, they form a picture of a species living close to its demographic threshold. The quiet question that follows is not about failure. It is about fragility. How many small losses can a population absorb before no one remains to notice the final one? Imagine this. You're moving through a valley at dusk, carrying a day's warmth on your skin from the slow walk across open ground. Your group is a small one. Familiar faces, familiar footsteps. The wind shifts, and for a moment you smell smoke that is not yours. You pause, listening. A distant crack of wood, a rhythm of movement that does not match the animals. You know you are not alone. Somewhere beyond the next rise another fire burns. Another kind of human is out there. 50,000 to 43,000 years ago, two lineages met in moments like this, not as myths, not as symbols, but as people sharing the same land for the first time in deep time. The archaeological record of these encounters is thin, quiet, and deeply human. No battlefields, no sudden boundaries. Instead, we find a handful of places scattered across the Levant and parts of Europe, where two worlds touched gently at the edges, leaving only small ripples in the sediment. These regions of overlap do not speak of domination or dramatic conflict. They suggest coexistence at low densities, with long periods where groups might never have known that the other camped just a day's walk away. To understand these early encounters, we look first to the Levant, that narrow bridge of land where Africa meets Eurasia. It was here, in layers of stone and dust accumulated across tens of thousands of years, that archaeologists found the earliest clues of alternating occupation. In caves like Kabara and Kafse, different populations lived in the same spaces, but not at the same times. The layers rise like quiet chapters, a period dominated by one lineage, then another, back and forth, sometimes over spans of centuries. This alternating pattern suggests a landscape that welcomed both groups, but not necessarily side by side. Climate oscillations likely played a role, opening the Levant during warmer periods and tightening it during colder ones. When conditions shifted, one group may have moved in as the other moved out. These were not sudden encounters, they were slow approaches. Farther north and west in the rolling hills of southeastern Europe, the archaeological traces show similar patterns of low-density overlap. At certain sites, tools associated with one lineage appear in layers not far from tools associated with another, but the layers do not mix in ways that suggest crowding. Instead, they show a landscape with enough space for groups to pass through regions without frequent contact. The valleys and forests of the Balkans would have softened these encounters, giving each group room to move seasonally without necessarily meeting face to face. Imagine what this would have felt like on the ground. A group of Neanderthals might arrive at a familiar cave to find old hearth ash that does not match their pattern. A stone flake shaped in a style their own hands didn't make. The smell of a fire burned from a different kind of wood. These discoveries could be intriguing or unsettling, but they would not have carried the weight of inevitability. In a world of low population density, contact might be rare enough that it became a story told around the fire, not a daily concern. When two groups did meet, those interactions could have taken many forms. The archaeological record cannot tell us their emotions, but it can tell us something about their proximity. Certain regions show signs of alternating or overlapping use of the same natural shelters within a single millennium. That is a wide window, yet close enough to imply that each group knew the other existed. Tracks in mud, footprints in snow, discarded tools, or fresh butcher marks on an animal could have been the silent messages exchanged long before any words or gestures. In caves across Central and Eastern Europe, we sometimes find mixed assemblages of tools. These are not evidence of imitation or competition. They are the natural product of groups using the same locations during different seasons or different years. The layers speak of proximity without conflict, of shared landscapes without shared lives. When populations are small and highly mobile, cohabitation does not require direct contact. It requires only that the same sheltered valley remains appealing to both. The question of how these groups perceived one another is one we will never answer fully, but the archaeological evidence encourages a neutral framing. There is no sign of systematic violence between them, no sign of raiding or territorial wall building, no fortifications, no mass burials that suggest conflict. In fact, the record ignores drama entirely. It shows only quiet coexistence, faint traces of lives lived in parallel rather than collision. Consider the rhythms of a valley in southeastern France around this time. A small group of Neanderthals may have used a cave during winter, drying meat, repairing hides, and tending to injured members. Months later, another group of humans might pass through during spring, drawn by migrating herds. They would find the cave empty, but its walls would still hold the soot of the previous fire. The ground would still carry the prints of barefoot children. The pattern of flint flakes on the floor would reveal where someone had sat, shaping a tool. These details would have been legible to anyone with eyes trained by a lifetime of close observation. They would have known others were here, but the land was large enough that the two groups need not cross paths, unless chance brought them to the same riverbank or the same cluster of berry bushes. Some sites in the Danube corridor show a similar rhythm. Season after season, year after year, groups passed in and out of the region, leaving behind tools, bones, and ash. The sequence of use is not chaotic. It is patterned, almost polite, as if the landscape itself mediated the encounters by offering multiple options for shelter and movement. In such a world, contact is neither inevitable nor intense. It is occasional, fleeting, shaped by luck and season rather than pressure. If we look at faunal remains from these overlapping zones, we see no clear evidence that the arrival of one group displaced the hunting patterns of the other. Rather, each group appears to have followed its familiar strategies, targeting prey well suited to their historical practices. This suggests that early encounters did not immediately create competition. The land was still generous enough to support two kinds of hunters without forcing them into conflict. When archaeologists study the microstratigraphy in shelters known to have been used by both lineages, they sometimes find interesting sequences. A layer rich in carefully prepared flakes typical of Neanderthals might sit beneath a layer with different tool forms, but the transition is gradual. There are no signs of abandonment under duress, no sudden breaks. Instead, the sediment accumulates gently, as if one group moved on and the other arrived later by natural seasonal movement. What is perhaps most fascinating about this period is the neutrality of the record. There are no clear signs that the two groups viewed each other as enemies. There are no signs they viewed each other as friends either. The archaeological evidence simply shows that they shared space in low densities, sometimes within the same valleys, sometimes at different times, sometimes stepping into landscapes recently shaped by the other. We can imagine moments of curiosity, A hunter kneeling beside a stream might find a footprint with proportions unlike the ones made by his companions. A child playing in a clearing might come across a discarded tool shaped in a pattern unfamiliar to her group. A group approaching a cave might smell smoke lingering from a recent occupation. These moments would not have the suddenness of historical encounters we know from later periods. They would be quiet, ambiguous, layered with questions rather than certainty. The Levant provides some of the clearest windows into these dynamics. The alternating layers suggest that climate shifts brought different groups into the region at different times. When conditions were favourable, one group might expand northward into the area. When conditions cooled or warmed again, the other might reclaim it. These oscillations unfolded over centuries, far slower than any individual could perceive, but clear in the sediment. Around 50,000 years ago, as conditions became more variable in parts of Eurasia, groups moved along river corridors and across open plains. The movements were not migrations in the large-scale sense. They were slow drifts, small shifts in seasonal patterns, families exploring new valleys, clans adjusting to ecological cues. In this shifting mosaic, occasional encounters would have occurred, but the record suggests they were brief. The most neutral way to frame these encounters is as interactions between two human worlds moving through the same land without fully intersecting. Each carried its own traditions, its own rhythms of life, its own ways of reading the land. When they noticed each other, the recognition might have been simple. Others are here, others like us, but not exactly us. The quietness of this record is important. It tells us that the meeting of these two lineages did not begin with fanfare or conflict. It began the way many things in deep time begin, gradually, with more absence than presence, more inference than certainty. When we sift through the sediment layers of these shared landscapes, we find overlapping hearths, alternating toolkits, and signs of small groups passing through familiar valleys. We do not find clear evidence of fear or hostility. We find the trace of coexistence, a delicate coexistence shaped by distance, environment, and the slow pace of Paleolithic life. And perhaps the gentle reminder held within these early encounters is this: the first time two human worlds met, they did so not as conquerors or rivals, but as distant neighbours passing quietly across the same ancient ground. What if I told you that the boundary between two human worlds was crossed not by armies, not by conquest, but by a whisper in the dark? A moment when two individuals came close enough to share a life, and in doing so, changed the genetic future of everyone who came after them? The story of interbreeding between Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens is quieter than most people imagine. It happened rarely, unevenly, and across vast stretches of time. Yet each of those encounters left a molecular trace that still lies in the genome scientists study today. Between roughly 60,000, 100,000, and 45,000 years ago, small windows opened where two lineages met, mingled, and then drifted apart again. When geneticists first sequenced the Neanderthal genome in the early 21st century, they expected a clear divide. Two species, two evolutionary trajectories, two genetic histories. Instead, they found threads woven between them, faint but undeniable. The evidence did not come in the form of entire chromosomes or obvious signatures. It appeared as small fragments of ancient ancestry, scattered across the genome like tiny archaeological sites of their own. These fragments told a story that neither fossils nor tools could reveal, that at several moments in deep time members of the two groups shared children. The earliest of these windows seems to appear around 100,000 years ago. This is long before Homo sapiens established any lasting presence outside Africa. The genetic evidence for this early admixture event is subtle, found in the genomes of a few ancient individuals and detected through careful comparisons of genetic branching patterns. What this suggests is not a broad mixing, but an isolated encounter. Perhaps a small group of early Homo sapiens wandered into a region occupied by Neanderthals. Perhaps the encounter was brief, perhaps seasonal, perhaps involving only a handful of individuals. But it happened because fragments of ancestry from this period appear in Neanderthal genomes, not just in modern humans. In other words, some Neanderthals carried threads of early Homo sapiens well before the major migration events. This early interbreeding moment is easy to overlook because it left no dramatic archaeological signal. It did not reshape tool traditions or alter hunting strategies. It was a biological exchange, not a cultural one. And like many things in deep time, it left only a faint trace. Yet it tells us something profound. The boundary between the two groups was permeable from the beginning. Whatever differences existed between them, they were not absolute. The second window opens around 60,000 years ago, and this one is clearer. Genetic data from multiple ancient individuals reveal that this period saw a more substantial admixture event, likely occurring somewhere outside Africa as Homo sapiens expanded into southwestern Asia. The population densities were low, and interactions were likely sporadic. Yet the patterns of shared ancestry suggest that this was the moment when hybrid children became the ancestors of many later Homo sapiens lineages. This does not imply widespread mingling. It points instead to a small number of unions whose descendants happen to become geographically successful. Genetics often magnifies the impact of rare events through the slow mathematics of population growth. These children would have grown up in communities that did not think of species the way we do. They would have been judged by their abilities, their social bonds, their place within a small group. The concept of hybrid identity is a modern burden, not a Pleistocene one. From a scientific perspective, however, their existence tells us that behavioural and biological compatibility between the two groups was strong enough to produce viable offspring. That itself is a boundary-crossing event of extraordinary significance, because it reveals that the line between these human worlds was never as sharp as once believed geneticists describe the process of hybrid ancestry entering a population as introgression. When fragments of Neanderthal DNA entered Homo sapiens lineages during this 60,000-year window, most of those fragments did not persist. Over generations, natural selection removed or diluted many of them. But a few remained, not through symbolism but through usefulness. Among the fragments that survived are genes related to immune system function, particularly those involved in detecting and responding to pathogens. This implies that the hybrid offspring inherited certain immune traits advantageous in the environments they encountered. In plain terms, some Neanderthal adaptations to Eurasian pathogens made life slightly easier for the Homo sapiens who later carried those genes. This is one of the most remarkable aspects of the genetic record. The interbreeding did not produce blended cultures or merged technologies. It produced a small set of inherited tools inside the body, molecular defences tested by hundreds of thousands of years of life in Eurasia. It is a reminder that in deep time, biology and culture often operate on different scales. Technology can shift quickly, but immune systems carry memories of landscapes long after their cultures disappear. The third window appears around 45,000 years ago, based on the genomes of some of the earliest Homo sapiens found in Europe. These individuals show evidence of having recent Neanderthal ancestors, not distant admixture from tens of thousands of years prior, but grandparents or great-grandparents whose ancestry was still fresh in their genomes. This suggests that even at this late stage, When Neanderthal populations were shrinking and their territories contracting, interactions still occurred in some regions. These were not widespread events. They were likely specific to certain valleys or corridors where small groups encountered one another by chance. But they were genuine, and their genetic traces remain in the earliest Homo sapiens individuals found in Europe. What did these encounters look like on the ground? The archaeological record is silent on the moments themselves. There are no sites where two groups lived together in large numbers, no communal hearths revealing shared daily life. Instead, we see alternating occupations. A cave used by Neanderthals in one season appears later filled with the ash of a Homo sapiens hearth. A valley favoured by Neanderthal hunters shows a few tools from another lineage scattered among their remains. These are traces of proximity, not partnership. But proximity is enough for biology to act. Every successful hybrid child represents not just an encounter, but a degree of acceptance. A child must be cared for, fed, protected, and integrated into a group's social fabric. Biology alone cannot guarantee that. Something in the meeting of these two human worlds, curiosity, attraction, cooperation, or simply circumstance, allowed that child to survive. Each hybrid life therefore becomes a small testament to the ways in which humans recognize other humans. Even across evolutionary divides, most Neanderthal ancestry introduced during these windows gradually disappeared. This is a natural process. When two populations mix briefly, the minority ancestry tends to dilute over time unless it carries specific advantages. Some fragments persisted because they contributed to immune system function. Others may have influenced skin physiology or metabolic pathways related to cold adaptation, though these interpretations remain debated and uncertain. What is clear is that only a fraction of the genetic exchange endured. The rest faded as generations unfolded. In deep time, this fading does not diminish the importance of the events themselves. Genetic introgression is not a measure of cultural connection. It is a record of human encounters at their most intimate level. When we trace these fragments today, we are not measuring identity. We are measuring contact, rare, quiet, and biologically consequential. The humility required here is enormous. Genetics can tell us that interbreeding happened. It can estimate when. It can reveal which fragments of ancestry persisted, but it cannot tell us what these individuals thought of each other. It cannot reconstruct their emotions, their fears, their reasons. It cannot show us whether these unions were alliances, brief encounters, or the result of small groups crossing paths in unpredictable landscapes. We must live with that uncertainty. It is part of the dignity of science to admit what we do not know. What we can say is this: the presence of multiple windows of admixture suggests that contact was neither singular nor accidental. It happened in different places, at different times, in small pockets of interaction that never grew into lasting shared populations. Over tens of thousands of years, these quiet exchanges shaped the genomes of future lineages, leaving biological echoes that outlived both worlds. And perhaps the reflection that follows is this: when two human worlds meet, the deepest traces they leave are not in stone or bone, but in the quiet threads woven into the bodies of those who came after. Imagine this: a landscape carved by hundreds of thousands of years of Neanderthal footsteps, where every valley, every riverbank, every shelter has a memory older than our species. Now imagine a different kind of human walking into that landscape. A human who arrives not as an invader or conqueror, but simply as another small group following the slow pull of prey, water and seasonal light. Around 43,000 years ago, Homo sapiens began crossing into Europe in numbers large enough for archaeology to notice. And when they arrived, the land that had shaped Neanderthals for so long began to shift around them, not through conflict, but through the quiet pressure of a new ecological rhythm. The story of these early dispersals is not dramatic. It is not a wave crashing against a shore, nor a sudden surge of population overwhelming an older one. Instead, it is the story of families and extended bands moving along river corridors and forest edges, exploring new routes as conditions allowed. When we imagine these newcomers, we must picture them as small groups adapting to unfamiliar landscapes with the same daily concerns as any humans: food, shelter, warmth, safety, and the steady maintenance of social bonds. Their arrival in Europe at this time reflects not a single movement, but a mosaic of dispersals that unfolded across generations. To trace these movements, archaeologists rely largely on the distribution of early Homo sapiens sites and the signature patterns of their lithic industries, without invoking cultural superiority or symbolic behaviour. What we see between 43,000 and 40,000 years ago is a slow but steady spread across regions that were once dominated exclusively by Neanderthals. The speed of this dispersal is striking when compared to the slow, punctuated patterns of earlier hominin expansions. Models based on site density and settlement spacing suggest that these groups moved flexibly, adjusting their ranges as resources shifted. The landscapes they encountered were varied. In some areas, dense forests still held their grip on river valleys. In others, the cold pulse of climate instability had opened up wide stretches of steppe where herds of herbivores roamed freely. These newcomers adapted to both. They moved quickly across open plains and followed herd migrations more fluidly than the groups that had evolved within these landscapes for so long. Their ability to track multiple prey species, shift between environments, and reconfigure seasonal routes appears to have been one of the quiet engines of their dispersal. None of this implies a comparison of intelligence or ability. It reflects differences in ecological strategy. Homo sapiens, emerging from varied African environments where mobility across large distances was common, carried patterns of movement that transferred well to the mixed environments of Pleistocene Europe. Neanderthals, shaped by the long-term demands of cold forests and close-range hunting, carried strategies that had served them reliably for hundreds of thousands of years. When climates changed rapidly, flexible strategies expanded more easily. One of the clearest archaeological signals of early Homo sapiens in Europe during this period is the widening distribution of their campsites within a relatively short span of centuries. Statistical models that examine the spacing between these early sites reveal a dispersal pattern consistent with populations following prey migrations and expanding into new ecological niches as they became available. These groups appear to have favoured river systems that acted as natural highways through the landscape. The Danube corridor, for example, provided a passageway that connected southeastern Europe with central and western territories, and the archaeological record shows a dotted line of ephemeral camps along its length. We must imagine these camps not as permanent settlements, but as temporary shelters, shallow caves, rock overhangs, windbreaks made from branches, and open-air sites beside rivers. The traces they left are light: hearth ash, butchered bones, stone flakes, and occasionally the faint outlines of bedding or hide-working areas. These fragile footprints, scattered across Europe, tell a story of groups moving frequently, adjusting their routes as conditions changed. This mobility gave them access to diverse prey, from reindeer in colder regions to red deer and wild horses in warmer patches. When we look closely at the faunal remains from early Homo sapiens sites, we see evidence of a wide dietary range. They hunted animals that migrated in large herds, but they also took advantage of smaller game when necessary. This versatility is visible in cut-mark patterns, bone breakage techniques, and the distribution of scavenged remains. It suggests that they were not tied to a single prey species or a single hunting strategy. Instead, they adjusted to what the land offered. This kind of ecological flexibility is one of the quiet forces that shape their expansion. At the same time, their presence in the landscape did not immediately displace Neanderthals. Instead, the record indicates that the two groups occupied different valleys or regions at overlapping times, each moving through their familiar spaces. The density of Homo sapiens groups during this early window appears low, meaning that direct encounters may have been rare. The land was vast enough to hold two human species without immediate conflict. Only when populations began to grow and routes overlapped more frequently would the ecological dynamics begin to shift. Another factor behind the newcomers' spread lies in the patterns of seasonal mobility. Some early sites show evidence of repeated short-term use across years, suggesting that these groups navigated large territories rather than remaining anchored to a narrow range. When prey changed their migration paths, these humans followed. When valleys froze earlier or warmed later, they adjusted. Their relationship to the landscape was less fixed than that of Neanderthals, who often returned to the same shelters for generations. Again, this is not superiority. It is a different ecological rhythm shaped by different evolutionary pressures. The terrain of Europe at this time also favoured exploration. Glacial systems to the north and mountain ranges to the south created natural funnels that guided movement. River valleys acted as corridors. Coastlines provided routes rich in resources. Some climatic modelling suggests that during brief warmer intervals within this period, patches of habitable land open like windows, allowing groups to push deeper into regions previously too cold or too resource-poor. These pulses of opportunity, combined with the mobility of Homo sapiens, allowed dispersal to accelerate. Archaeological traces do not show a dramatic shift in vegetation or animal behaviour, caused directly by the presence of Homo sapiens in this early window. Instead, they suggest that these newcomers were skilled at fitting themselves into the existing fabric of the landscape. They hunted the same prey animals found in Neanderthal territories, but did so across broader ranges. They moved more frequently and exploited microenvironments that were previously underused. Over time, this began to alter the balance of resource use, not through competition, but through the additive pressure of more groups navigating the land in overlapping patterns. The question often asked about this phase of prehistory is why the arrival of Homo sapiens seems so rapid compared to earlier movements. Part of the answer lies in demographic structure. Population models indicate that Homo sapiens groups expanding from southwestern Asia carried enough individuals to maintain growth across generations. Neanderthal groups in many regions were smaller and more isolated by this time. When a population grows faster, even modestly, it can spread over large territories within a few centuries. That does not require conflict. It requires only movement and time. Another element is resilience. Flexible strategies allow populations to withstand fluctuations in local conditions. If a herd moved unexpectedly, a group with broader mobility patterns could recover by shifting territory. If a valley suffered a sudden cold snap, these humans could track different prey elsewhere. Neanderthals were also resilient, but their strategies were optimized for dense forests and steady access to large herbivores. As the forests thinned and climates oscillated unpredictably, that long-honed ecological balance became harder to maintain. We must be cautious in interpreting this shift. The archaeological record is incomplete. What we see are only the preserved traces of a complex process that unfolded over centuries. We cannot assign intention to these movements. These groups were not seeking to replace anyone. They were following the same logic that drove all human dispersal. Find food, find shelter, protect the group, continue the lineage. As Homo sapiens moved across Europe, the landscapes they entered began to change subtly. New pathways were used more frequently. New hunting grounds experienced different rhythms of human presence. Valleys that once saw only seasonal occupation began to see repeated visits at varied times of year. None of this was dramatic at first. It was simply the quiet reality of two human worlds sharing a continent. By 40,000 years ago, the pattern had shifted enough that the landscape of Europe held more Homo sapiens groups than before. The newcomers were not yet numerous, but they were present across a wider range. Their flexible movements had carried them into regions that had once been the stable refugia of Neanderthals. The ecological fabric of Europe was being rewoven, not through conflict but through footsteps. And perhaps the quiet reflection here is this: landscapes remember how we move through them. When a new rhythm enters an old land, the land itself begins to change. These early dispersals of Homo sapiens did not overwrite the world of Neanderthals overnight, but they set in motion the slow reshaping of a continent, one campsite, one migration, one valley at a time. The wind cuts sharper than it did a generation ago. The forest that once wrapped a valley in shelter has thinned into scattered trunks. The animals you relied on still pass through, but less often and leaner than before. The rivers freeze earlier. The seasons shift in ways your grandparents would not recognize. Between 42,000 and 39,000 years ago, Europe entered one of its most unstable climatic intervals. In this tightening world, two human species faced a single question without ever speaking it aloud. What do you eat when the land begins to refuse you? The archaeological record of this period is one of scarcity layered in bone. We see it not in dramatic abandonments or sudden collapses, but in the quiet signatures of changing diets, shifting hunting patterns, and subtle experiments in survival isotope studies, cut-mark distributions, faunal assemblages, and the seasonal layout of camps, all reveal how these humans, both Neanderthal and Homo sapiens, responded to a world becoming less predictable. To understand why food scarcity became such a pivotal force, we need to step back into the environmental context. Around this time, climatic fluctuations intensified, forests retreated in many regions, giving way to more open, colder environments. The herbivores that had long supported Neanderthal diets, particularly red deer, wild horses, and woodland large game, changed their migration patterns. In some zones they moved northward, in others they shifted to higher elevations. These animals were not disappearing entirely. They were simply becoming harder to track with the reliable regularity on which Neanderthals had structured their subsistence strategies. For tens of thousands of years, Neanderthals had evolved in and adapted to the rhythms of dense, cold forests. Close-range hunting with thrusting spears demanded proximity to prey and familiarity with the terrain. Their diets, as revealed by nitrogen isotopes, show heavy reliance on large herbivores. This was not a flaw. For hundreds of millennia, it was a highly successful strategy, but as forest habitats fractured and prey became less predictable, that specialization became harder to sustain. Homo sapiens, newly expanding into Europe, had emerged from ecologies where wide mobility and diverse foraging strategies were essential. Their subsistence patterns, reflected in isotopic values from early European individuals, show a broader dietary range. They hunted many of the same animals as Neanderthals, but did so within larger territories and with greater variation from season to season. They supplemented this with small game exploitation, riverine resources in some regions, and opportunistic scavenging. This flexibility did not indicate superiority. It reflected different evolutionary histories responding to the same tightening world. When we examine the faunal remains from sites dated between 42,000 and 39,000 years ago, we see significant shifts. In some Neanderthal layers, the bones of high-calorie, large herbivores dominate as before, but the overall quantity drops. This suggests reduced hunting success or smaller group sizes. In other regions, especially in Western Europe, the faunal assemblages begin to show more fragmented bones, as if the groups were extracting every last calorie from dwindling resources. Marrow extraction becomes more intensive. Burn marks on bones indicate processing of even the lower value parts of animals. These are not signs of collapse. They are signs of adaptation under strain. A clan that once secured enough meat in a few coordinated hunts now had to work harder for the same returns. Meanwhile, early Homo sapiens sites from this window show a different pattern. Cut mark frequencies on small mammals such as hares and foxes increase. These animals had always been present, but earlier hominins largely ignored them because they were harder to catch and offered lower caloric return per unit of effort. Yet in times of scarcity, hunting small game becomes valuable, not because it replaces large game, but because it fills gaps when larger prey fails. Some coastal and riverine sites show shellfish exploitation and fishing remains, though these are limited and heavily dependent on regional geography. Where they occur, they reveal groups broadening dietary options when the land tightened. The earliest evidence of systematic freshwater fishing in Upper Paleolithic contexts is debated, but hints of occasional aquatic resource use appear cautiously in the archaeological record around this time. The survival divide between the two species was not a matter of capability. It was a matter of which strategies scaled under environmental pressure Neanderthals could and did adapt. But their adaptations often remained within the framework of what had worked before, focusing on large herbivores, intensifying marrow extraction, and shifting to refugia where prey still clustered. Their mobility patterns appear to have remained narrower, tied to familiar valleys and seasonal routes. Homo sapiens, by contrast, expanded their foraging radius more easily. Their seasonal movements appear more flexible, following prey into new territories when necessary. Their camps were often lighter, less tied to specific shelters, and more easily relocated. This does not mean they were more skilled hunters, only that their patterns of movement were shaped by different ancestral ecologies. Another factor emerges when we examine the spatial distribution of campsites. Neanderthal sites during this period show longer reuse of specific shelters, short radius movements, and repeated occupation of traditional hunting landscapes. Early Homo sapiens sites, in contrast, often appear as temporary stops within much larger networks of mobility. Some sites indicate short-term stays with abrupt abandonment, consistent with groups moving frequently between ecological zones. This pattern matters because mobility is a buffer. When a region becomes temporarily unproductive, a mobile group can shift its subsistence focus, target new prey, or track herds across greater distances. Groups with more fixed subsistence territories face narrower margins when food sources fluctuate. As climatic instability continued to tighten over the following millennia, this difference in mobility and dietary breadth would play an increasingly significant role. But during 42,000 to 39,000 years ago, we see only the early outlines of this divergence. There is also evidence that specific Homo sapiens groups expanded their use of plant resources more than Neanderthals did. Microfossils of starch grains and plant residues appear on some early Homo sapiens stone tools. These do not represent large-scale plant processing, but they indicate occasional foraging flexibility. In cold Europe, plants contributed less to total caloric intake, but even small additions could make a difference over the course of a difficult winter. We must be careful not to imagine this period as a binary split between specialists and generalists. The reality was more complex. Neanderthals experimented with small game exploitation. In some regions, Homo sapiens still depended heavily on large herbivores where available. Both groups adapted. Both groups endured periods of scarcity. Archaeology gives us incomplete fingerprints, not full stories. But the patterns that do emerge reveal two species navigating a patchwork world with different ecological toolkits. In valleys where resources were steady, both groups could thrive side by side. In regions where prey declined, flexible strategies offered a slight but accumulating advantage. A group that could switch prey, shift territory, or exploit new microenvironments when needed had a better chance of maintaining population size over generations. As the forest continued to thin and climatic pulses struck with greater frequency, this difference began to matter more. A winter with fewer red deer would strike a Neanderthal clan harder if the group had limited alternatives. A Homo sapiens band might track reindeer farther north, or shift toward a different valley entirely. Over a single year, the difference was small. Over centuries, it reshaped the map of survival. Still, we must resist the temptation to draw moral or narrative conclusions from these patterns. This is not a story of one species outcompeting another deliberately. It is a story of landscapes tightening, and two human worlds responding with the strategies evolution had prepared for them. Perhaps the quiet truth of this period lies not in triumph or failure, but in fragility. Every species depends on the land beneath its feet. When that land changes faster than memories or tradition can adapt, survival becomes a question of timing and luck as much as skill. By the end of this window, around 39,000 years ago, the survival divide had begun to widen. Not because one group deserved to endure more than the other, but because the world was changing in ways that rewarded mobility, dietary breadth, and flexible ecological rhythms. And maybe the reflection left behind by these ancient bones is this: scarcity does not choose survivors. It simply reveals which strategies bend and which break when the world grows cold. A homeland that once stretched from the Atlantic to the Caucasus now fits inside a handful of valleys. A continent that carried your ancestors for hundreds of thousands of years has narrowed into small pockets of warmth, tiny islands of survivable climate surrounded by a cold that grows deeper each season. Between 40,000 and 38,000 years ago, Neanderthals lived inside landscapes that were no longer whole. They lived in refugia, fragments of a world that was slipping away. When we speak of refugia, we do not mean safe havens or strongholds. We mean environmental leftovers, microclimates where the winds eased slightly, where forests retreated slower than elsewhere, where rivers held onto their flow, where prey still passed in small, uneven numbers. These places did not promise comfort. They simply allowed survival for a little longer. The Iberian Peninsula is the most widely recognized of these last refuges. Its position at the southwestern edge of Europe created a patchwork of climates that buffered the full force of northern cold. In certain coastal zones, mild temperatures persisted thanks to Atlantic currents. In river valleys, pockets of vegetation remained even as the broader continent fell into harsher conditions. Archaeological traces from this period show Neanderthals occupying caves and rock shelters across what is now northern and southern Spain and parts of Portugal. They left behind hearths clustered close together, as if groups were staying within shorter ranges than before. These last Iberian sites contain familiar Mousterian tools, but often in reduced diversity. This does not mean that knowledge was forgotten. It means that the groups were too small to maintain the full spectrum of their technological repertoire. When a population shrinks, expertise does not disappear suddenly. It fades with the people who carried it. A single specialist toolmaker might have produced a certain type of scraper or prepared core. If that person died without teaching their technique, the tradition ended with them. Archaeology captures the fading of skills not as a story of failure, but as an echo of demographic contraction. Along the Iberian coasts, another pattern emerges: increased reliance on shellfish in some regions. Shell middens appear in a few late sites, showing that Neanderthals continued to use coastal resources as climates cooled. This behaviour was not new. It had earlier precedents in other parts of their range, but in these late refugia, shellfish became a more stable resource compared to unpredictable inland prey. Coastal foraging does not represent a dramatic shift in subsistence strategy. It reflects a narrowing menu in a tightening world. Mussels, limpets, and other shellfish provided calories when large herbivores moved erratically or disappeared from nearby valleys. Moving eastward, we find other pockets of survival in the southern Balkans. These landscapes, shaped by complex topography, provided microclimates that buffered the cold mountain ranges, created sheltered valleys where vegetation clung on a little longer. Lakes and rivers retained their seasonal cycles. Here too, Neanderthal traces from around 40,000 to 38,000 years ago show small, sporadic occupations. Tools appear in thinner layers, hearths are fewer. The campsites feel quieter, not because the people were less capable, but because there were fewer of them. In some Balkan shelters, archaeologists have found hints of repeated short-term visits rather than long seasonal stays. This suggests groups were moving more often, perhaps strained by diminishing prey or searching for better conditions. Such movements were not migrations in the grand sense. They were the small adjustments of families trying to remain viable in an environment that no longer offered predictable returns. What we see across these refugia is not a single narrative but a mosaic of regional survival strategies. In some areas, groups clung to valleys they had known for generations. In others, they shifted between ecological pockets, seeking patches of stability. The common thread is contraction, not just geographic contraction, but demographic contraction, cultural contraction, and ecological contraction. One of the most striking features of this period is the uneven distribution of Neanderthal presence. Some valleys show evidence of use around 40,000 years ago, but fall silent by 39,000. Others show traces as late as 38,000. This patchiness is not chaos. It is the natural pattern of small populations scattered across isolated habitats. Each group followed its own trajectory, shaped by luck as much as by skill. Some valleys may have held onto small herds longer than others. Some waterways may have provided shellfish or fish when surrounding uplands froze. Some sites may have had better shelter from winter winds. Refugia are fragile by definition. They are remnants of old climates surviving inside the new. A small change in temperature, a shift in rainfall, or the loss of a few breeding individuals in a herd could change the viability of a region almost overnight. The archaeological record shows this fragility. Some caves that once hosted Neanderthal hearths became empty within a generation. Others continued to see occasional use until the final traces disappear. When we examine the late Mysterian toolkits from these regions, the reduced diversity stands out. Cores become simpler. Scrapers become more generalized. Points are fewer. This does not suggest declining intelligence or loss of cognitive ability. It reflects demographic mathematics. Smaller populations can maintain fewer specialized traditions. Cultural complexity often tracks population size, not biological capacity. A dwindling community cannot support the same range of skills as a thriving one. Another clue to shrinking populations comes from the distribution of animal remains. In some late Neanderthal sites, faunal assemblages suggest reliance on smaller prey or scavenging behaviours when large herbivores were absent. This does not represent desperation. It represents adaptation within limits. Groups used what their landscapes provided. When opportunities allowed, they hunted red deer or ibex. When opportunities did not, they turned to smaller animals or coastal resources. But even the best adaptation cannot overcome certain thresholds. A population needs a minimum number of breeding adults to remain viable. Genetic diversity must be maintained. Territories must be large enough to secure food, but small enough to navigate without excessive energy cost. When a species retreats into refugia, each of these constraints tightens. At some point, the system cannot sustain itself. What is remarkable about the Neanderthal story is how long they endured these pressures. Their last refugia persisted for thousands of years after their range began contracting. They continued to hunt, to cook, to process hides, to raise children in landscapes that were slowly unravelling. Their end was not sudden. It was the quiet fading of small groups in isolated pockets of land. We cannot know how they perceived these changes. Did they notice the forests thinning? Did they wonder why the herds came less often? Did elders speak of times when winters were shorter or prey more abundant? Their lives unfolded at the scale of seasons and generations, not millennia. For them, the land still offered what was needed, until one day it no longer did. And perhaps that is the most human part of this story. Extinction does not arrive as a dramatic event. It arrives as smaller winters, thinner herds, quieter caves, and the slow dimming of fires in valleys where ancestors once gathered today. When we stand in Iberian caves or Balkan shelters where the last Neanderthals lived, the silence feels heavier. Not because we know their end, but because we sense how hard they held. On their refugia were the final chapters of a species that had thrived through countless climatic upheavals. They adapted until there was no land left that could hold them. The question that lingers is not why they disappeared, but how they endured for so long inside landscapes that had become too small for their history. Imagine standing on a hillside in southern Italy, long before cities, roads, or names, watching the horizon bloom with a light no storm had ever made. A glow spreads upward, slow at first, then faster, until the sky itself seems to peel open. In that moment, there is no word for eruption, no concept of volcanic winter, no story yet formed to explain why daylight has turned the colour of bone dust. There is only a cold wind, and a world suddenly older than its inhabitants can bear. Something happened around 39,000 years ago that left a physical scar across the entire European continent. It was not written down, but the ash remembered everything. Beneath the soils of Italy, Greece, the Balkans, and even parts of Western Asia lies a thin, dark layer called the Campanian ignimbrite tephra. It is volcanic glass and pulverized rock, the shattered remnants of one of the largest eruptions of the late Pleistocene. Archaeologists sometimes call it the dividing line because in cave after cave and site after site, the cultural material on one side of the layer is not quite the same as what lies on the other. It is a boundary not only in geology but in human time, a horizon that marks a world before and a world after. For a long while, we did not know what the layer meant. Now we know just enough to understand that the eruption was vast and its consequences global, but not enough to say exactly how it was felt by the last Neanderthal groups who lived through its shadow. The eruption itself began in the volcanic region of the Phlegraean Fields near the Bay of Naples. It was not a gentle event. Models based on ash distribution suggest a column rising tens of kilometres into the atmosphere. injecting sulfur and fine particulates into the upper air. When these particles spread, they drifted east, then north, then outward in a widening pall that settled like a thin grey snowfall over thousands of kilometres. In some places, the ash is thick enough to form a solid, measurable band. In others, it is only a few millimetres thick but still unmistakable under a microscope. Each grain carries a chemical signature linking it back to the same eruption, no matter where it is found. This is how we can trace its reach from southern Italy to as far as parts of Russia. When geologists talk about events like this, they think in terms of disrupted sunlight, rapid cooling, and short-lived but severe environmental stress. When archaeologists examine sites with the ash layer, they see something slightly different. A quiet replacement of one pattern of tools with another, a shift in animal remains, a thinning of camps, a sense that populations were already stretched thin before the ash ever fell. This may be the hardest truth hidden in the tephra. The eruption did not strike a thriving population. It struck one already reduced, already fragmented, already surviving in pockets of land where microclimates offered a little warmth or a little food at the right time of year. Still, it is difficult to imagine that the fallout had no consequence. Even a thin veil of ash can affect vegetation, and vegetation affects everything built upon it. Pollen cores taken from lakes show that in the centuries surrounding the eruption, there were abrupt coolings, nearly step-like transitions between relatively mild phases and sharply colder ones. Ice cores from Greenland, though far removed, record similar shifts in temperature, suggesting that the eruption coincided with one of several cold snaps during this period. Whether the eruption triggered the cold pulse, or whether it simply overlapped with a climate already entering instability is still debated, but the timing alone places the Neanderthals in the path of not just one environmental challenge, but several at once. Archaeological layers immediately above the ash often show a simplification of toolkits, fewer large mammals, and signs of shorter, more temporary occupations. In Iberia, where some of the most persistent Neanderthal refugees appear, the ash layer is faint but present, and the sites after it become increasingly sparse. This does not mean a sudden disappearance. Extinction rarely looks like a single moment. It looks more like a dwindling series of returns to familiar places, each visit leaving behind fewer traces until the traces vanish entirely. The eruption may have accelerated a decline already underway, making the margins narrower, the risks greater, and the refugees more fragile. Imagine a small Neanderthal group living in the years after the ashfall. The forests on which they depended were thinner. Some animals they once hunted favoured more open ground now, making them harder to find or predict. In places where ash settled thickly on vegetation, grazing animals would have suffered, and their suffering would have affected everything that relied on them. Even if the eruption did not instantly transform the ecosystem, it could have tipped already fragile food webs into new patterns. And because Neanderthals lived in relatively low densities, with small group sizes and limited long-distance networks, any disturbance might have been absorbed less easily than by more dispersed or flexible populations. It is tempting to imagine the eruption as a catastrophic moment, a sudden wiping away of people and cultures. But the evidence does not show abrupt abandonment. Instead, we see persistence in a changed environment. We see attempts to return to old landscapes, to continue long-held traditions, to make the same tools that had worked for thousands of years. The ash line is a reminder that geology can freeze a moment in time, but life on the ground continued in fits and adjustments. Still, the line is there, and its presence across such a wide geographic area makes it one of the most reliable markers for discussing the last phase of Neanderthal history. This layer poses a question for us now, one we can only answer carefully. Would the Neanderthals have endured longer if the eruption had never occurred? The honest response is that we do not know. By the time the Campanian ignimbrite blanketed Europe, Neanderthal populations had already contracted in many regions. Climate oscillations were frequent, prey species were shifting their ranges, and demographic stresses were accumulating. The eruption may have been a final pressure, but it was not the first, and perhaps not even the most decisive. Yet its presence in the sediment makes it a powerful symbol of fragility, of how quickly a stable pattern can crack under sudden environmental force. As we trace the thin ash line across caves and riverbanks, it becomes more than a geological artifact. It becomes a quiet boundary between two human ages, one in which Neanderthals still occupied landscapes their ancestors had shaped for hundreds of millennia, and another in which those landscapes continued without them. The line does not tell us exactly how or why they disappeared. It only ensures that we cannot tell their story without acknowledging that the world changed abruptly at least once in their final millennia, and perhaps that is the deeper truth the ash holds. A species can be shaped beautifully by its environment, but it cannot choose the timing of the world's upheavals. Some pressures arrive slowly, others arrive in a single plume of fire and dust, and for a population already stretched thin, even a short winter of ash might be enough to push survival from difficult to impossible. What remains in the soil is the memory of that moment, preserved in silence, asking us to consider how delicate persistence can be when the earth decides to turn the page. Imagine following a coastline where the wind feels sharper than memory itself, where every step forward reveals another small sign that a new kind of human strategy has taken hold. Picture a faint path where footprints repeat season after season, not randomly but with intention, as if the land itself has been folded into a schedule. Something changed around 38,000 years ago across Europe and Western Eurasia, and the soil still carries pieces of that transition. It was not a single invention or a sudden revolution. It was a network of quiet decisions spread across thousands of kilometers that added up to a strategy fitted exactly to a world turning colder. Archaeologists call these people the Gravettians, a label for a tradition rather than a tribe, a pattern rather than a face. Their traces begin to appear after the volcanic ash that marks the end of an earlier horizon, and they spread quickly across river valleys, plains, and coasts. The remarkable thing about this expansion is not speed alone, but coordination. Their sites show repeating choices, repeating habits, and repeating solutions to the same problem: how to survive a landscape sliding into deeper cold. While earlier groups moved reactively, following herds or forests, the Gravettians seem to have moved proactively, almost as if they anticipated where resources would be before the seasons changed. This is not a guess. It is what the locations of their camps suggest when mapped across the terrain. One of the clearest signs of this strategy is the way Gravettian sites align along rivers and coastal routes. These waterways were not just sources of food, they were corridors, predictable, navigable lines through shifting climates. On these riverbanks we find camps positioned near migration routes of animals like reindeer and horses, but also near places where fish, birds, and smaller mammals could be taken with relative consistency. In a world where forest retreated and open steppe expanded, such corridors would have been among the few reliable arteries left. The Gravettians seem to have understood this intimately, placing camps just upstream of rapids where fish bottlenecked, or near wetlands where waterfowl gathered seasonally. Another remarkable feature of Gravettian life is the sheer diversity of prey species represented in their sites. Instead of relying primarily on large mammals, as many previous groups had done, they exploited a range of animals that required different techniques. Small game bones often appear in significant quantities, suggesting the use of traps or snares. Archaeologists infer nets from the patterns of stones, plant fibres, and the bones of animals that are difficult to catch by hand or spear. Such practices would have allowed them to gather food while expending less energy, a crucial advantage in an increasingly cold environment where calories were precious. These strategies did not require advanced symbolism or elaborate cultural expression to function. They required attentiveness to the land, memory passed through generations, and an ability to plan ahead in ways that are visible only through the footprints they left behind. Some sites show evidence of seasonal return with layers built one over another, each separated by enough time for the land to recover. This implies not just movement, but rhythm. They knew when to arrive, when to leave, and how long each patch of earth could be used before it risked being depleted. The Gravettian approach appears especially well suited to environments where winters were long and summers short. Their camps often feature substantial hearths and traces of structures that provided good insulation. Some were dug partially into the earth, taking advantage of natural thermal stability. Others used dense piles of bones or packed sediments as windbreaks. These are small details, but they tell a story of people who viewed the landscape as something to be calculated, shaped, and endured with intention rather than reacted to in crisis. Another insight emerges from how their sites reflect cooperation. The patterning of bones and tools suggests task specialization within groups. One area might contain evidence of butchering, another of hide preparation, another of tool production. This kind of spatial organization within camps implies that multiple tasks occurred simultaneously, perhaps by different individuals with distinct roles. Such coordination makes sense when dealing with large seasonal hunts, small game trapping networks, or fish harvesting. It does not require hierarchy, only shared purpose and efficient use of time. If we think about the world in which the Gravettians emerged, the picture becomes sharper. By 38,000 years ago, Europe was experiencing repeated cooling pulses. Forests withdrew in the face of expanding steppe. Some of the prey species favoured by earlier hominins shifted their ranges or declined in number. In this context, a strategy built on flexibility, planning, and diversified food sources would have been particularly advantageous. It is not that other humans lacked intelligence, it is that the Gravettian adaptations aligned closely with the demands of the moment. Imagine standing in one of their camps during late autumn. Smoke from a hearth rises in a thin line, caught by the wind. A group of people clean small animals caught in snares set earlier in the morning. At the riverbank, a net is being repaired, fibres twisted and pulled into shape. In the distance, someone scans the horizon for signs of migrating herds. The land feels cold, but not empty. It is a place threaded with knowledge, with expectations about what will come next. This is what survival looks like when it is distributed across the seasons, rather than concentrated in a single hunt. It is important to note that none of this implies perfection or inevitability. The Gravettians faced challenges just as every human group did. Their strategies emerged because the world demanded new ways of thinking, not because they were superior in some general sense. They simply aligned their actions with the ecological pressures of their time more effectively than the populations whose ranges they entered. In another climate or another era, their methods might not have been the ones that flourished. Still, when viewed against the archaeological record, the expansion of Gravettian networks coincides with a period in which other hominin groups were diminishing. This overlap invites caution in interpretation. but it highlights how timing can shape survival. In an era of shrinking forests, growing cold and unpredictable seasons, the Gravettians dispersed into landscapes that were becoming increasingly challenging. They did so not with overwhelming numbers or with unprecedented tools, but with a strategy rooted in flexibility and anticipation. As we follow their traces across Europe, from coastal shelters to inland plains, it becomes clear that they did not see the land simply as a backdrop. They treated it as a partner in survival, responding to its signals and patterns with a blend of caution and ingenuity. Their success does not erase the presence of those who came before them. It only tells us that in this narrow window of time, a particular way of living aligned with a particular shape of the world. And perhaps this is the quiet lesson hidden in their expansion. Human survival is not merely about strength, intelligence, or invention. It is about fit, the match between what a group can do and what the world requires. For a few thousand years, as the cold deepened and resources shifted, the Gravettians found that match. Their camps linger in the soil as reminders that adaptation is sometimes the simple act of listening to the land more closely than the groups around you. Imagine walking into a cave where the silence feels heavier than the rock. The floor is familiar. Chipped stones, scattered bones, a hearth circle darkened by smoke from thousands of nights. And yet something is wrong, though you cannot name it at first. The tools are not the same shape. The soot on the ceiling is different. The bones of hunted animals are cut in new angles. It takes time to understand what your eyes already know. The people who once lived here are no longer the ones who returned. In archaeology, disappearance rarely announces itself. It is the slow withdrawal of a presence until only absence remains. To understand when the Neanderthals vanished, researchers do not look for a dramatic final moment. They look for gaps, breaks in continuity, places where a familiar pattern ends and does not return. Between 39,000 and 30,000 years ago, traces of Neanderthal life fade in ways that are subtle but decisive. The challenge is that a vanished population does not leave a message behind. Instead, it leaves the stillness left by its departure. Archaeology becomes the study of that stillness, reading the land for what is no longer there. One of the most reliable methods for understanding disappearance lies in tool horizons. Neanderthals left behind a distinctive technological signature: prepared cores, Levallois flakes, thick scrapers, and points designed for close-range hunting. These tools are not just objects, they are behaviours repeated over vast spans of time. When these objects cease to appear at a site where they were once common, archaeologists take notice. And across Europe, between the last years of the 40,000 range and slightly after, the Mousterian horizon thins, then stops. In some places it ends abruptly, in others gradually, but it does not resume. At first, scholars debated whether this meant replacement, assimilation, or simply poor preservation. But the pattern is too consistent to ignore. In layers dating after the Campanian ignimbrite ash and into the following millennia, the tools that appear belong to different technological traditions entirely. There is no gradual blending, no hybrid toolkit that suggests the two cultures merged over centuries. The Mousterian simply doesn't reappear. It is difficult to fake absence at such a scale. Stones do not rot. They do not vanish without reason. Another form of evidence comes from skeletal material, or rather its absence. Neanderthal remains become extremely rare after about 39,000 years ago. We do not find bones in later layers, even in places where earlier fossils are abundant. In archaeology, Bones can survive extraordinary lengths of time under the right conditions, so the sudden disappearance of a once common species is notable. The absence of Neanderthal skeletal remains at sites that continue to be occupied after their departure is a powerful indicator. Where humans remain, Neanderthals do not. Soot signatures also provide one of the subtler but most revealing clues. Caves used over long periods accumulate layers of microscopic soot from countless fires. These layers record not just the presence of humans, but how they built and maintained their hearths. Neanderthal hearths tend to produce a specific profile, distinct temperatures, repeated placement patterns, and materials burned in consistent proportions. When soot layers change abruptly, archaeologists can infer a change in the people responsible for the fires. Around the period of interest, soot signatures shift in ways that suggest new groups with different fire use habits began occupying the same shelters. The fires continue, but the hands feeding them are no longer the same. Even the distribution of animal bones tells a story. Neanderthal diets were heavily oriented toward large mammals, especially in colder periods. Their hunting strategies left characteristic marks on bones, specific cut angles, marrow extraction patterns, and choices in which parts of animals were brought back to camp. After their disappearance, these patterns give way to different ones. There is more small game exploitation, more fish, and different butchering marks. These changes are not random. They reflect the presence of people who use the landscape differently. The old habits end and new ones begin. In archaeology, this shift is as telling as a vanished footprint. Site abandonment is another key part of the puzzle. Many of the traditional Neanderthal territories show periods of reduced occupation or complete abandonment. The reasons are varied. Climate stress, shrinking forests, competition for key resources, or demographic decline. But the effect is visible in the sediment layers become thinner. Hearths become fewer. Caves that once show repeated, seasonally patterned occupation stop being used altogether. When sites that were inhabited for tens of thousands of years suddenly fall silent, the silence itself becomes evidence. Genetic data adds another layer of clarity, though carefully interpreted. In ancient DNA recovered from later human remains across Europe, the genetic signatures that would indicate direct continuity with Neanderthal populations do not appear. There is evidence of earlier admixture, yes, but not of Neanderthal genetic persistence, after roughly the same period that their archaeological traces vanish. Genetic continuity is a powerful marker in deep time studies. The absence of late surviving Neanderthal lineages supports the archaeological record. Their disappearance was final. Imagine again the cave where the pattern ends. The last Neanderthal group may have left without ceremony, without knowledge that they would never return. Perhaps they followed a herd that never circled back. Perhaps a cold pulse made the valley too barren. Perhaps their group numbers became too low to sustain themselves. Archaeology cannot reconstruct the final decision, but it can observe the aftermath. In the next layer, shaped flint flakes of a different style appear, left by people who approach the landscape with new habits. The cave did not become empty forever. It simply held a different kind of human after the old one left. This raises a quiet question, though not one we can resolve easily. How long does a disappearance have to last before it becomes extinction? If a group retreats beyond detection, if its last members live in places where traces are unlikely to survive, how do we know the exact moment they were gone? The truth is that we do not. What we have instead is a boundary in evidence, a horizon where presence becomes absence. In this time range, that boundary is remarkably consistent across Europe and Western Asia. no site securely dated after 39,000 years ago contains Neanderthal fossils or an uncontested Neanderthal toolkit. Absence is not emptiness, it is a form of information. When archaeological layers lack what once filled them, the missing pieces speak just as loudly as the ones we can touch. The absence of Neanderthal traces tells us about changing landscapes, shifting populations, and the fragility of small, isolated groups facing environmental and demographic pressures. Their disappearance is not marked by a single event or catastrophe. It is a gradual fading, like the end of a fire whose embers are no longer fed. To study such a disappearance requires humility. The Earth preserves only fragments of its stories, and the late survival of hominin groups is especially difficult to trace. But the consistency of negative evidence is what makes this case so compelling. Tools, bones, soot, shelters, animal remains, and genetics all converge on the same conclusion. Not because we seek it, but because the land shows it again and again. As we read through these layers of absence, what we see is not a dramatic end, but a quiet one. The world did not carve a monument to their departure. It simply continued without them, filling the spaces they once held with new rhythms of life. And in that continuation, we find the shape of the story. Extinction not as a moment of destruction, but as the quiet stopping of a pattern that had held for hundreds of millennia. Imagine this for a moment. You walk into a landscape that holds no memory of your footsteps, yet somehow feels familiar. The wind moves across the grass in long, unbroken strokes. A cave mouth sits open, dark and shallow, its walls still carrying soot from fires that have not burned in tens of thousands of years. No bones, no tools, no bodies lie in sight, only space where someone once lived, someone who thought, breathed, feared, and hoped within the same world you now stand in. The earth beneath you remembers them, even if their voices have gone quiet, and it is in that quiet that a question unfolds, not about origins or rivalry, but about what it means when an entire way of being slips into silence. There is something deeply human about looking for yourself in others, especially in those who came before. The Neanderthals were not an alien presence in our past. They were another version of humanity, shaped by different winds and different winters, carrying their own rhythms of life. Their disappearance leaves us with more than archaeological puzzles. It leaves a shape in the world where a lineage once stood. We often talk about extinction in terms of what disappears, but rarely in terms of what remains afterward. The unclaimed stories, the unfinished adaptations, the memories locked inside landscapes that no longer receive their footsteps. When we sift through layers of sediment or hold a stone flake shaped by a Neanderthal hand, we are not just touching a technical artifact. We are touching a moment of decision. Someone choosing where to strike a piece of flint, someone planning a hunt, someone teaching a child how to survive a winter longer than memory. Their extinction does not erase these moments. It only prevents them from continuing. And perhaps this is the quiet weight behind their absence. A whole thread of human possibility that reached its end not because it was lesser, but because the world shifted faster than a small, scattered population could adapt. It is easy to imagine extinction as a sudden event, dramatic, violent, a single decisive blow. But the truth of deep time is softer and more unsettling. Extinction is often slow. It is a dwindling, a narrowing of ranges, a thinning of groups, a quiet surrender of ground as climates change and options close. The last Neanderthal may not have known they were the last. They may have simply felt the land changing beneath them, the seasons shortening, the forests pulling away into colder distances. Their end was not a moment of failure. It was the end of resilience stretched too thin for too long. There is humility in recognizing that we survived where others did not, because conditions tilted in our favour at a particular moment in history. Not because we were destined, and not because we were uniquely chosen by evolution, but because a certain combination of flexibility, climate, and chance aligned around our lineage. The disappearance of Neanderthals reminds us that survival is never guaranteed. It is an ongoing negotiation between biology, environment, and circumstance. One slight change in any of these, and our story might have looked very different. When we speak of another humanity, it is tempting to romanticize or dramatize, yet the truth is quieter. These were beings who faced cold mornings, shared food, healed each other's wounds, and stood under the same stars we do today. Their extinction is not a moral lesson or a warning about dominance. It is a reminder of fragility, of how many forms of life have risen and fallen on this planet before us, and it places us gently within that scale, temporary, adaptable, but not immune to the forces that shape the rest of nature. In the absence they left behind, we also find continuity. Some of their genes live within our bodies, faint echoes of ancient encounters that shaped our immune systems and our responses to the world. But their culture, their language, their songs, if they had any, are gone. The disappearance of a people is not merely biological. It is the vanishing of a way of seeing the world. A hunter-gatherer child once sat at a hearth, listening to a story we will never recover. A mother once sang something soft to her infant on a night when wind battered their shelter. A group once watched the northern lights rip across the sky and felt something we cannot name. These moments did not survive in bone or stone. They survive only in the silence where they once lived. If we step back and look at the long arc of our species, the loss of Neanderthals is not just a scientific fact, it is a mirror held up to our own impermanence. One day, far into the future, another intelligence, human or not, might look at the layers we leave behind and notice a horizon where our traces disappear. They may ask the same questions we do now. What happened to them, and what did their silence mean? The story of the Neanderthals reminds us that extinction is not about blame or victory. It is about the fragile thread that ties each lineage to the world, and how easily that thread can fray. Perhaps the deepest realization is that their fate is woven into our own identity. Without their presence, a species became the last surviving branch of a once diverse family tree. Their absence defines our solitude. It forces us to acknowledge that we are not simply the inheritors of the earth, but the last witnesses of a story nature once told in many forms. We are the only surviving version of something that was once plural, and that should evoke not pride, but perspective. Imagine the final truth their silence leaves us with, that being human has always been a shared state, not an individual species, that we belong to a lineage shaped by encounters, by coexistence, by parallel evolutions, and that our story is incomplete without the chapters written by those who walk beside us, even if their footsteps have faded from the ground. Their disappearance is not just the end of a species, it is the closing of a possibility, a reminder that intelligence and strength are not enough to guarantee continuity. And in that reminder we find a deeper kind of understanding, that to be human is to exist within a narrow window of conditions, luck and adaptation. We are not outside nature's rules, we are simply one of its many experiments, successful for now, fragile in the long term. And so this episode ends not with a conclusion, but with a realization that another humanity once stood beside us, and their silence is part